First up, special guest, celebrated speaker and best-selling author, Dr. Gabor Mate is a physician with a background in family practice and a special interest in the potential lifelong impacts of trauma on physical and mental health. His latest book is right there, The Myth of Normal, Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. Welcome to the show, Gabor.
Thank you so much. It's nice to be here with you. I've seen you so often. It's nice to be speaking with you.
Here's the book. Now, I want to show... It is a big, thick book. It's like as thick as the Bible. And, but it's an amazing book. I've got it dog-eared all over the place. Every time you open it up, it's something amazing about that you didn't know. So the first thing, it's called The Myth of Normal, Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. Now, why does it, so it bothers me when I see people as their Twitter profiles and they'll say trauma survivor. And I'm like, oh, you're 30. Right, so that's how I feel. Like
it was old trauma on Twitter, probably.
So, tell people what you think trauma is, how it gets caused, and why people want to identify with it like that.
Well, let me begin with the identification. When people identify themselves as trauma survivor, I say, no, you're not, because that's not all who you are. So why identify yourself with just one experience in life, even if it's an important and formative experience? That's not who you are. You're far more than that. So I think to identify oneself as a survivor of anything is to restrict one's sense of who one is.
So my identity is not a guy with diarrhea? I'm more than that.
Right, come on, let's try. So, so what does that say about people who do want to identify with their trauma like that?
I think they take a certain pride, which is probably merited in having come through something and having maybe gone past it in some ways, but they don't realize that it also limits who they are and limits their sense of self.
Okay. And why does that annoy me so much? That's a good question.
Because it's like fighting to be less than what you actually are, that I watch a bunch of people do nonstop. That's what the whole identity thing is. Like, please reduce me. Like, don't know anything about me. Just know.
So go.
There might be I don't know why it annoys you so much, but I can tell you something about myself. That whenever I'm really annoyed by something, it does reveal something about myself, not just about the thing that I'm annoyed with. So, I'm not going to get into speculation, but there's probably something in you that has to do with trauma and having gone through it, and something that maybe on some level causes you discomfort. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to go into analysis here, but there's always something about us that upsets us, not just the thing that we're upset about.
So go ahead and tell us what trauma is, how it affects your maturity process, and how it affects you as an adult, and what you can do about it.
Yeah. That's a lot of questions in one, but let me start with one. So what trauma actually is trauma is a word that we use too often and a bit too promiscuously on the one hand. On the other hand, we don't use it nearly enough. So people say, I went to the movie and it traumatized me, or I had a fight with my partner and I got traumatized. No, you didn't. You were just upset. You were stressed. But that's on the one hand. So it's overused. On the other hand, where it really matters, which is in the legal system or the medical system or the education system, the word is hardly used at all. And it's totally not understood and appreciated. So trauma is a wound. The meaning of the word trauma comes from a Greek word for wound or wounding. So trauma is a psychological wound that we sustained that has long-term impacts and is ingrained in our nervous system, in our bodies, and in our minds, so that it restricts, constricts, limits who we are, who we think we are, how we react or respond to life, how we relate to other people, how we see the world. For example, if I told you that a certain person said that the world is a horrible place, it's a dog-eat-dog world where your friends, they want your wife, they want your house, they want your wealth, and these are your friends, you'd probably understand that this man was highly traumatized in childhood, and that suffering in childhood shaped how he sees the world. This happened to be the previous president of the United States. He said this in so many words, Trump, I mean. And we know when we read the biography by his niece, Mary Trump, who was a psychologist and whose father drank himself to death. This is Trump's brother. What a traumatizing childhood this man had. So, and so did his opponent, by the way, Hillary Clinton, as I talk about in this book. So I'm an equal opportunity trauma diagnostician. I don't choose political parties. You know, it's not about politics. It's about the personal imprint. But it does show up in how they relate to life and to politics. So trauma is a wound that leaves its imprint, and you can be basically, and trauma is not what happens to you. So trauma is not the tsunami or the war, or in my infancy, the Holocaust, or sexual abuse or physical abuse. Trauma, those are the traumatic events, but the trauma is the wound that we sustained as a result. So trauma is what happens inside of us, not what happened to us, but what happened inside of us as a result. And typically, when bad things happen to a child, one of the first things that happens is the child assumes that it's their fault, there's something wrong with them. So they become ashamed of themselves and disconnected from themselves. So that's the actual trauma. Now, to make a long story short, you can traumatize, wound kids in two ways. You can wound them by doing bad things to them, such as poverty, racism, abuse, addiction in a family, violence in a family, and so on. But you can also wound kids, and this is very prevalent in this culture, by not meeting their needs. Like I could wound you by hitting you, but I could also wound you by depriving you of oxygen. Now, children have certain needs, and in this culture, those needs are subverted, they're suppressed, and very often the opposite is delivered. So there's a lot of traumatized people in the society who can't look back on anything terrible happening. The problem wasn't that terrible things happened. The problem was that the good things that should have happened didn't. So those are the two forms of trauma, the big T trauma, the terrible things, and the small t trauma are the good things that didn't happen. But one way or the other, trauma is a wound that you sustained, and that has an impact on your life.
So you talk about, a trauma making you lose connection to your authentic self.
Yes.
And, I've heard people describe sin that way. And that when you go against your nature, when you go against what's best for you, when you're detached from who you are, your authentic self. Now, doesn't that so when you do something as a child that gets met with negative reaction from your primary caregiver, you then have a choice, right? You have a choice to either keep doing that thing or lose your connection to your primary caregiver. And so normally we have a need for connection. You're going to suppress that part of you, and that goes into your unconscious, and that creates a little trauma. Am I close to it?
You're absolutely describing it accurately. Let's take Trump's opponent, Hillary Clinton, if you like. At the one of your favorite characters, I know that because I watch your show, and so at the Democratic Convention in 2016, there was a video played, narrated by the voice of God, Morgan Freeman, about Hillary Clinton's life, and Hillary described the following incident as an example of wonderful parenting that gave her resilience, and the experience was that she's 4 years old. She runs into her mother's home because she's being bullied by neighborhood kids. And the mother says, there's no room for cowards in this house. Now you get out there and you deal with it. No. What's the message to the child? Not that there's no room for cowards, because a 4-year-old kid looking to the mother for protection is not a coward. She's a typical little mammal. You tell a mother gorilla to ignore the distress and danger of their child, now you're going to find out what the rage is all about, So a 4-year-old kid, the message she gets is not that there's no room for cowards, but there's no room for vulnerability in this house. So she represses her vulnerability, puts on this tough, suck-it-up persona, which then makes her put up with the philandering of her husband, and she sucks it up, even makes it her fault. And then when she's a candidate and running for election, she gets pneumonia. Do you remember what she did?
Yes. She kept campaigning.
She sucked it up. She kept campaigning until she collapsed in the street with fever and dehydration. And that's the imprint of trauma. And that's also the kind of distant and inauthentic persona that so many people didn't like about her, and these are all trauma imprints. So now you had this American population in 2016 had a classical choice between two people, both of them significantly traumatized, running for the presidency. But this is how trauma shows up.
Boy, there's so many things that I want to say.
I don't want to do my own research, but I might have to read this book.
It's a great, there's so many, so when you have this trauma, right? So you have a trauma of, so isn't that the ultimate magic trick though, Gabor, so when a primary caregiver, usually the mother, has to get the kid to separate and be, independent, but still maintain connection. It's like a jujitsu trick that most people don't, and that's where most people get damaged, traumatized, right?
Well, it's exactly how you put it earlier. The kid gets disconnected from themselves in order to stay connected with the parents.
Right.
So that's what in this book we call this tragic tension between authenticity and attachment. Attachment being our necessary drive to be connected to our caregivers. Authenticity, feeling our feelings, our gut feelings, and be able to express them, experience them, and act on them. And as you suggested earlier, when the kid gets the message is that who you are and your emotions are not acceptable to your parents, the kid will suppress that, disconnect from themselves in order to stay connected to the parent. The problem is that this dynamic doesn't go away automatically. In fact, it becomes your personality or part of your personality. And then that inauthenticity becomes your identity.
So that's how people can become pleasers, right? They lose, they don't even know what their own likes and dislikes are. They have to look to another to get it, right? Correct?
They become pleasers. They automatically imbibe the values of their parents or their teachers, their schools, their society, their culture. In other words, they become very good customers and very good compliant people with all the manipulation that takes place in this culture. And worse than that, these committed or compulsive people pleasers, they have a high risk of autoimmune disease and cancer because from a scientific point of view, the mind and the body are not separable. And in fact, in real life, they're not separable at all. This is something that the medical profession, despite all the science that has been published for the last 100 years, doesn't realize. And so that people that suppress themselves also are messing with their immune systems. And that leads to a lot of illness or a lot of mental illness, for example. Like take a condition like depression. I mean, it's so obvious. What does it mean to depress something? It means to push it down. What gets pushed on in depression? People's emotions, so they feel flat. Why did they push their emotions? Because their parents couldn't accept them how they were. So what begins as a coping mechanism leads to pathology later on in life.
So this coping mechanism is to detach from your authentic self, right? That's the coping mechanism. And then now you have this trauma in your unconscious, or as Jungians would say, that you have a complex. You have a complex, and then it can get triggered, right? So something that would upset me wouldn't upset you, and that's because we all have our own personal histories and our own personal traumas or complexes, and so those are the parts of ourselves that we deny ourselves, but they're part of us, and we don't realize that. That's why it's in our unconscious. And so would you say that the key to healing that is to first make that unconscious trauma wound conscious?
Well, yes, and the first chapter opens with this story of me arriving at an airport here in Vancouver, where we live.
Yes.
Speaking trip, and I'm 78 now, so this happened when I was young and stupid at age 70, and I arrived home from the I arrived home from the speaking trip, and my wife, whom I'm expecting to pick me up, texted me and says, "I haven't left home yet. Do you still want me to come?" And my wife's an artist, and we've only been married by that time around 45 years, 46 years. And when she's in the art studio, you know, I don't know if you ever know an artist, but they went in the flow, they forget everything, you know.
Yeah, it's all right brain, man. You go out lose time.
Exactly. There's no husband, there's no bladder, there's no belly, there's only the art. So my wife typically forgot. And so as an adult, I know that. But how did I respond? Just along the lines you were saying now. I sent back a really terse, angry text saying, never mind. And I take a taxi home. And when I come in the house, I'm not even looking at her, and I'm barely grunting at her. And for 24 hours, till she finally says, knock it off already. No, and I did, actually. And the fact that I could knock it off after 24 hours was major progress. But what it's about the fact that when I was 11-month-old, my mother gave me to a stranger to save my life. And I didn't see her for 6 weeks. And when I saw her again, I wouldn't even look at her for several days, which is the defensive response of the infant, who says, I was so hurt when you abandoned me that I will not open myself up again. Now that's lodged in my mind, in my nervous system, without any recollection for the event. And so when the woman in my life, who I'm expecting to show up for me, isn't there, that gets triggered. Now that may not happen to you. You know, if your wife doesn't show up at the airport, you may say, oh, gee, too bad, I'll take a taxi home, you know?
No, believe me, there'd be some hell to pay for that.
Can I ask you a question?
Let me just real quick about, so that's like a core wound for you. So when you were a kid in World War II, your mother had to give you away for like 5 weeks.
Yeah.
And you didn't know. So what does that do to your psychology? It makes you, as you grow up, now when you, so this airport thing, it triggers that, right? And now, but you were, so why were you able to get over it in 24 hours as opposed to 48 or 72 hours before?
A few years earlier, it would have been several days, you know, because I am getting a bit smarter as I get older, I hope, you know.
Okay.
And, but what it did for me psychologically is the infant doesn't understand where the parent is coming from. So we're not talking about whether the parent loves the child or not, or does their best. We're talking about how the child interprets the events that happen to them. I couldn't understand, my mother's giving me away to save my life. The message I get is, I'm not wanted, I'm not lovable. And that lack of being wanted and being lovable then stamps my personality and makes me behave in ways to want to be loved and to want to be wanted. And one of the ways you can be wanted is to become a workaholic doctor. And now the whole world will want you when they're dying, when they're being born, and every minute in between when they're sick, which means what? I ignore my own kids because I'm too busy wanting to be wanted. What message do they get? So this is how we pass it on from one generation to the next without even knowing that we're doing it.
So that's what happened with Aaron. Anyway, I was wondering.
Aaron told me about. I have a question about when you're saying people get trained to be pleasers, because I'll tell you why it's so interesting to me. Usually when I hear that talk, it's almost always gendered. You know, like women are generally the pleasers, and stuff always didn't ring true to me because I've watched these characteristics in every single person. Like, is that even an element of it, really, like male or female, or is it really just any kind of trauma depend? Because that infant thing sounds really, you know, before you even have the age of reason, it's like put in you. Well,
see, it is gendered in this culture. It's not gendered biologically, but it's gendered in this patriarchal culture. So, which is the gender in this society that's more trained to please other people, to suck up other people's stresses, to look after other people's needs, ignoring their own? It's women. Which is why there's this big medical mystery, which to me is no mystery at all. Why is it that 70 or 80% of people with autoimmune diseases are women? Because they're the pleasers. Not by nature, but by culture.
You know, guys I know that I would, in a patriarchal way, call women have that same issue with autoimmune diseases being pleasers. And I mean, I didn't think it was biological, but I do notice that with that kind of personality.
Let me just jump in to say that our emotions affect our biology. So there's no
gender. Sorry, not biological.
It's biological. it becomes biological, but our biology is shaped by our life experiences and our emotional experiences. As an American physician said in 1977, human beings are biopsychosocial creatures. So, for example, a study a number of years ago showed that the more experiences of racism an American black woman experiences, the greater her risk for asthma. In other words, the constriction and inflammation of her lungs is a reflection of a social dynamic, not just a pathology that originates in her lung because of the stress. And so that if we realize that we're biopsychosocial creatures, we realize that our biology is shaped by our relationships and our social context.
So you talk a lot about that. So I've heard you tell this story about how women who are in unhappy marriages, if they talk about them, they don't get sick, and if they suppress it, they get. So now I was raised by rageaholics, and so I have a lot of that in me. And so what's funny to me is like, so if I get upset and rage, it's out of me. Like I don't carry it then. Mm-hmm. But my wife, it stays in her, right? Like I'm over it, but she'll carry it for a while, right? So that's the difference between her and I. So I won't get cancer, but aren't I supposed to get heart disease and high blood pressure? I mean, is there a win? Like if you express your anger, is it a lose-lose or a win-lose? Or
that's a really key question, because what we're talking about here is the distinction between healthy anger and unhealthy anger. So there's three things you can do with anger. One is you can repress it, push it down, in which case you're more likely physiologically, for all kinds of scientifically proven reasons, you're more likely to have autoimmune disease or malignancy. Or you can express it in an unhealthy way, in which case the rage that you describe, in which case definitely you're at higher risk for high blood pressure and strokes and heart disease. Or you can express anger which is healthy. So there's a distinction between healthy anger. I used to be a rageaholic myself. I mean, I know that. My kids saw that, and that rage that you describe about yourself, or that I used to experience a lot as well, is not actually healthy anger. It's anger that's been suppressed since childhood. Then it bursts out of you like a volcano when somebody touches you on a certain spot, and it just explodes like a pressure cooker blowing its top. In fact, we have the expression "blowing your top," don't we?
Yeah.
And that's not, I hate to tell you, but that's not healthy either. So there is such a thing as healthy anger, which actually preserves your life and your integrity. Then there's a repression of it, or the unhealthy rage.
So Carl Jung has a saying that problems can't be solved; they can only be outgrown. And so I've experienced a little bit of that. When I was younger, we didn't have boundaries. I grew up in a family of 12 kids, right? So we didn't have our own bedrooms or anything, and so we were constantly having our boundaries violated. We didn't even know what that was to have a boundary, and my mother would always cross our boundaries and physically go into our drawers and stuff like that. One time when I started comedy, I would record it, and my mom went into my drawer, got my recorder, listened to it. Of course, it was all filthy, horrible. I was a young comedian. I didn't know what I was doing. It was just disgusting stuff. And I came home one day and she had it in her hand and she's like, "I listened to your comedy." No, I had read enough self-help books by that point. I was 24 to know that she had crossed a boundary and I didn't have to respond to this, and that this was her problem and not my problem. And so I just said that to her. I go, "Hey, that's mine. You weren't supposed to listen to it." And I left. Now, normally I would walk out and be upset, like, "How dare she? God dare!" But I didn't have any of that. It was like, so I was, I had outgrown, like what she didn't trigger me anymore because I knew it wasn't my problem. It didn't press anything. I'd kind of outgrown her control in a sense. And I had real freedom. Like, to me, I've starting to realize that freedom is freedom from yourself, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Freedom, as long as these traumatic wounds or imprints govern our lives, we're really like puppets on a string. And the strings are pulled by our unconscious, our complexes, as you put it earlier. And we're just like this, and we think we're free, but in fact, we're constrained by the strings that bind us and that make us act in certain ways. We're not responding to anything, we're just reacting automatically, which is not the same as a conscious adult response. So it sounds like in this incident, you're able to respond like an adult. You didn't react, you responded.
Right. That's the difference, to not be reactive. I didn't know what that meant for the longest time, but now I do know what that means. Right. You react, you don't you don't have a reflex, knee jerk.
Well, how come every time I'm really trying to concentrate on that, that's when I'm the most not going to pull. We just did a streaming show with some friends of mine where I go, Jimmy, talking about, Ukraine nonsense. And I go, Jimmy, you're going to want to yell, but don't. I said, Jimmy, a whole text, like, you're going to want to yell at these guys. And then 5 seconds in, dude, I'm yelling right after I said, I'm blowing my top immediately.
He tells me not to yell at it. He's the one. You know what's funny, Gabor, is that, you talk a lot about how the culture is not supporting us. And here, let me read from your book. It says, "It is my contention that by its very nature, our social and economic culture generates chronic stressors that undermine well-being in the most serious of ways, as they have done with increasing force over the past several decades." So can you talk about that and the society shock absorbers and things like that? Go ahead.
Sure. So when you look at the literature on what stresses people, and here I have to stress the fact that stress isn't just an emotional event. Stress affects your immune system, your nervous system, your hormonal apparatus. Chronic stress, short-term stress, which is just a healthy response to a threat, helps you fight back and to escape. But chronic stress undermines your health in multiple ways. It's not even vaguely controversial. Now, when you look at the literature on what are the triggers for stress, apply these to our society. See how apt they are. Or conflict, loss of control, loss of information, and uncertainty. Now this society couldn't be better designed to impose a sense of loss of control. Mm-hmm. We're being manipulated all the time. Your show all the time talks about how we're being lied to about the most serious things. Conflict. We'll look at the situation right now. Uncertainty. I live in Canada. You live in the U.S. These are two of the richest countries in history, and 20% of Canadians are going to have to ask for some charity this year. Talk about uncertainty, and with the inflation, then you have the racial disparities, and you have the incredible health discrepancies between populations of different so-called color, so that this society is, and when you actually look at loss of control, well, you and I both know, and you talk about this all the time, about how when you look at the two major parties, they just sort of like Humpty, Tweedledee and Tweedledum.
That's it.
And Ralph Nader once said that the two parties are like one person with two heads. You look at, with different looking heads. But when it comes to major issues of economic or foreign policy, and whose interests do they serve? Warren Buffett, no less, said in the New York Times that of course there's class war, and it's my class, the billionaire class, that's waging the war and winning it. So when you actually look at who controls, very few people. And most people have a deep sense. And of course, some politicians are able to exploit that and run against the elite. Most people sense that they lack control, and they believe these politicians that think will restore control to the ordinary person. Of course, that never happens.
No. So just to get, there's so much to cover. There's so much important stuff, the whole, like, it could be 4 different books, like the part about the mind-body connection and so let's talk about the mind-body connection. Like, why Western medicine never talks about it, right? They never. Go ahead.
Well, sorry. I'm just so keen on this stuff. I interrupt my interviewers all the time.
Okay.
Sorry about
No, go ahead.
Socrates said 2,400 years ago that the problem with the doctors of today is that they separate the mind from the body. So in Western thinking, mind and body has been split for a long time. And if you look at indigenous cultures, they didn't have the sophisticated science and the amazing technological achievements of modern medicine, which are not to be sneezed at, but they're amazing. But they understood that the human mind, the body are not separable, which scientifically speaking, they're not. So that in the last 100 years, as I alluded earlier, there's been tens of thousands of research papers showing the unity of mind and body. It's not that even they're connected, because to say that they're connected is to say that two separate entities are connected. They're not separate entities. They're one. And whatever happens emotionally happens physiologically. It's that simple. And furthermore, the brain, which is kind of the governing apparatus, develops an interaction with the environment. So our parents' moods and emotions and how they talk to us and how they talk to each other, our mother's emotional states in the uterus, all these affect our brain development. So there's no separation of mind and body. And if we understood illness from that perspective, there's so much more we could do.
What if you have like my family's got a lot of bipolar history in it? Is that like an overblown? When I went to therapy, I got told if you grow up in that kind of thing, you kind of take on characteristics to like get by in like a bipolar household. Yeah. But is that like how much of that is like a real thing and maybe just the environmental thing? Because it seems like a real thing to me when I deal with somebody with it.
Well, no, wait a minute now. When you say, is it a real thing or an environmental thing? It's not either or. It's a real thing and it's environmental because the environment shapes the brain. That's the whole point. When you look at the modern brain literature or the development of the brain, it's not even controversial. The circuits of the brain are shaped from being in utero by our interactions with the environment. And the most important influence on the development of the brain is actually the quality of relationship with our nurturing caregivers. This is what's responsible for the physiology of the brain, actually, the neurochemistry of the brain. So, bipolar, it used to be thought, most people still think this is a genetic disorder. No, it ain't. There might be a genetic component, but nobody inherits bipolar disorder because something runs in our families doesn't make it a genetic problem. I mean, if none of my kids became doctors, but if they had, would that prove that the practice of medicine is a genetic disorder? Well, not necessarily, And what is inherited, perhaps, is a high degree of sensitivity, which means that kids are very much affected by their environment. And the more sensitive they are, the more they suffer when things go wrong. And bipolarity is a response to suffering. And the more sensitive you are, the more you'll suffer. The more sensitive you are, also the more creative, spontaneous, and inventive and insightful you're going to be. So sensitivity is both a blessing and a curse in that sense. And you can have two people with exactly the same genes, put them in different environment, they're going to be two very different people. So genes determine far less than is assumed. So what is actually inherited, I would say, are two things. One is the sensitivity, which is genetic, and the other is the trauma is passed on from generation to the next. Just as I passed on my trauma to my kids, this happens in families, not because it's anybody's fault, because that's how it works.
So I heard you talk about, so you're talking about how your brain gets developed and it has to do with your connection and if you got your needs met and the love and everything as a baby. Now, you talk about we're taught to not pick up babies when they're crying and when they're supposed to go to sleep. I remember as a kid, I had a little sister and we used to let her cry herself to sleep. And now that's not good, right?
Well, you look at any mammal. So we share these brain circuits with mammals, by the way. Dogs, cats, elephants, they have the same brain circuits for connection, love, caring, grief, pain, anxiety, anger, as we do. Now, what other mammal do you know that would ignore their babies crying? It goes completely contrary to nature and to our natural instincts. And in this society, we've become so disconnected. And as a physician, I used to tell patients, don't pick them up. They'll go back to sleep, until I found out better, And when you don't pick up a child, two things happen. One is the child gets the message that they don't matter, that their feelings don't matter. Number one. Number two, the brain gets flooded with cortisol, the stress hormone, and that interferes with healthy brain development. That's what we're doing to our kids. And we're doing that in loving families throughout this culture. There's any number of completely ignorant so-called parenting experts who are telling parents not to pick up their kids. Again, you tell a mother cat to ignore the cries of their infant, or a mother monkey, or a mother bear.
You don't think you should tell a young man you got to sit down in the corner until you get your mind right? You don't think that's how to parent?
Well, there is a very famous psychologist, Canadian actually, who in his mega-selling book, that's exactly what he advises, that when a child is angry, they should be made to sit by themselves till they come back to normal, as if anger wasn't a normal attribute of a young child who's frustrated, And when you give that message, we go back to that dilemma that you and I talked about earlier. You can have your emotions and your authentic self, or you can have the connection with me, but you can't have both at the same time. And
go ahead.
You're forcing the child to push down their anger and to disconnect from themselves.
And so you have to, you have to accept. So to change yourself, first you have to make it conscious, right? These parts of yourself that you put in your unconscious that get triggered, and then you project on other people. Like the people you hate the most, it's because it's in your unconscious, right? The people who trigger you, like the people who are, like, I don't get upset at Trump. I get upset at the system that gave us Trump. But I've noticed that people who get the most upset at Trump have Trump in their shadow, right? Yeah. That they're definitely projecting all that stuff onto Trump. They're just the opposite side of the coin.
Well,
so
if I have to say, because I've seen you quite often, I've seen you upset.
Oh, of course.
And you're upset more at the liberal class, aren't you?
Yes. Because I feel betrayed by them.
That's the whole point, is that the people that should be caring about you and doing the right thing are not. The people that, like Trump, you don't expect them to care about you.
Right.
but the liberal media and intelligentsia, which is, as you say, betraying people all the time. Now, that speaks to me of a wound that many people have, of the people originally in life who should have cared for them, didn't care for them the way they needed it. So there's a lot of anger that comes up around that,
Oh, okay. So you think it might trigger when I was younger and I didn't get my needs met, and now that this political system is not meeting my needs and gaslighting me, it's triggering that from my youth, right?
But look, I used to have a lot of political anger, and I still do sometimes. But I know that when I'm triggered, like when you talk about making it conscious, I think the best way to go about it is when you get triggered. And by the way, this word "triggered" is an interesting one. I pay a lot of attention to language. What's a trigger? It's a very small thing, isn't it? I mean, it doesn't work unless there's ammunition and explosive charges there. Now, who's carrying the explosive charge when I get triggered? I'm the one. So I get curious. So when I get triggered, the best thing I can do is, once I've calmed down and have regained some modicum of rationality, what was the explosive charge that I was carrying here?
Are we all Alec Baldwin is what he said? Thought I had a cold gun, but it was a hot gun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So also there's like big parts of ourselves that we don't like, which is why we put them in our unconscious. And it's kind of like trying to hold a beach ball. I've heard it described this way: holding a beach ball underwater, it comes out. So that kind of stuff is going to come out sideways. And that's when your wife doesn't pick you up at the airport and stuff like that. And so not only do we have to make it conscious, but the ugly parts of ourselves, and not the good parts of ourselves that weren't that are also in our unconscious, but there are actual bad parts of ourselves. There's greedy parts of ourselves. There's jealous parts of ourselves, right?
Yeah,
And so we
yeah.
have to not only make that conscious, but then we have to fully accept that as a part of ourselves without judgment, right?
There's a part of ourselves that wants to interrupt other people, which I just did. There's no bad parts. These parts all came along for a reason. The part that you don't like about yourself is actually originally came along to do something for you. Now it's no longer helping you, so you don't like it. But if you actually, and this is an exercise that we go through in this book, those parts we don't like about ourselves. There's a friend of mine, Dick Schwartz, who's a psychologist. He teaches a system called Internal Family Systems. He wrote a book called No Bad Parts. And my own particular approach is exactly the same. Any part of ourselves, like, some people hate the addicted parts of themselves, for example, But I say to them, what's an addiction? Addiction is any behavior in which you find some pleasure or relief, and therefore you crave it. And it causes harm in the long term, so you don't like it. But if you actually look at why you have the addiction in the first place, if I define addiction as, this is an example, any behavior in which a person finds temporary relief, pleasure, and therefore craves, but it causes negative consequences and they can't give it up. That's what addiction is. And I said any behavior, not just drugs, but also gambling, pornography, sex, gaming, internet, YouTube, shopping, eating, work, as in my case, anything. If you ask people, let me ask you straight up. I'm not going to ask you anything in particular or what or when, but according to my definition, have you ever had an addictive pattern in your life? And I don't care what it was. I'm not asking.
I did. I smoked cigarettes.
Okay. What did they do for you?
They were like my buddy. They gave me comfort. There was like a companionship. There was the nicotine was fun. There was the ritual of it, and it just kind of took me out of whatever I was doing. It distracted me momentarily.
Okay. Who needs to be distracted? Somebody who's in distress.
Mm-hmm.
And you say it gave you comfort, and I think you said companionship.
Yes.
Are they good things or bad things? Those are wonderful things. We all want them. In other words, the addiction wasn't your problem. The addiction was your attempt to solve a problem. The problem of isolation. The problem of emotional discomfort. Now, the addiction comes along as a friend who tries to help you. Don't be so uncomfortable. Don't be so disconnected. Don't be so stressed, Now, there's no point hating it. You might as well embrace not the behavior, but the intention behind the behavior, which is you just want to feel like a good human being, a comfortable human being. Any addict, that's all they want to feel. So why look upon it as an enemy? Try to understand where it came from.
Try to understand where the addiction came from, and it would come from me feeling disconnected or me feeling anxious and me wanting to feel comforted. And you would say, now, Kurt, you have a question about addiction?
Well, yeah, kind of. Because I've done every kind of drug, and I lived in New York for 20 years doing every kind. I met a lot of people, and I can honestly say probably only two people I can think of all the many thousands I met where I thought, and they exhibited these things where I took it as, oh, this is some kind of trauma, and no, they were like straight up acting like psychopaths with me, and I had never encountered it before ever. I was always, I've been all kinds of things. And people I met seemed just like unloved people, not loveless people. And I can only think of a couple, but man, it was very different. And if I spot a thing like that now, I'll be gun shy. If I spot any kind of, I had never encountered anything like that before until a certain point. And it was very like traumatic to me. And it was people that I thought were like friends kind of that I knew for a while. And like I said, very rare. Most of the people who I'm sure have done all kinds of like crimes, I didn't think of them as this, but how psychopath gets used a lot to the point of almost meaningless, but like, how do you spot when somebody's like, I found out this one person wasn't really traumatized at all in the way they didn't even care about the thing. They just knew to use it as a thing.
Oh, okay.
And I have a sympathy for that, and it kind of like shocked me the amount of like, oh, maybe this happened to you, but you don't seem to be bothered by it at all. I don't know. How do you like untangle that, or how do you watch out for something like that?
Well, if I understand your question right, you're asking about psychopaths here, people who are psychopathic in their behavior.
Yeah, I know that's a very overused thing thrown around, but I can say I've met two people where I'm like, oh, this is not like anything I've ever encountered.
There are people like that, but nobody's born like that. It's nobody's nature. And if you go to literature on psychopaths, they were all severely traumatized as kids.
Well, once you know, like, I believe that for sure, but once you, like, how do you deal with something? Like, you can't really, can you?
You have to set a boundary. Once this is where if we're connected to our gut feelings, you'll recognize that this person is just toxic. I can't have anything to do with them.
Yeah.
Set a boundary. It's not your responsibility to have them in your life. You just can't.
Yeah,
Otherwise, so this is where your own sense of authenticity and boundary needs to step up and say, no, I don't, they may have suffered that made them that way, but that doesn't mean I have to put up with them.
So, now an addiction, or an illness, I'm of the belief that sometimes illnesses show up and they're there to teach you something. It's like it's mystical, right? It comes like, I believe in a higher power and things like that. So I do think that there is a greater consciousness that can set up the future or do. So what do you think about that? Illnesses that we can learn from that are there to teach us something?
Well, in a sense, you're taking the words out of my mouth, because we have a chapter on disease as teacher. We call it a dreadful gift, disease as teacher. I wouldn't want to wish it on anybody. But the fact is, and if as a physician, if somebody comes to me with a disease, I'm not going to say to them, congratulations, you got this wonderful teaching ahead of you. That would not do. But at the same time, you're absolutely right. Some people can recognize that in this illness, whether it's the mind or the body, whether it's an addiction, autoimmune disease, depression, or I used to work in palliative care, where I looked after terminally ill people. And this is almost unbelievable, but I've had people who are going to die of the diseases, and there's nothing more we could do for them. And they say to me, Doc, I don't know how to explain this to you, but this disease is the best thing that ever happened to me. And what they meant by that is that they learned so much about themselves and what life meant and what was really important, that made their moments worth living, whereas before they had never led an authentic life. Now, again, I wouldn't push this on anybody, and I certainly wouldn't approach anybody with this kind of, in the shock of a diagnosis, but you're absolutely right. And if people can learn from their illnesses, at least in a significant number of cases, they can actually mitigate the illness. If, for example, if they can learn, if somebody with a flare-up of rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis, both of these diseases, a lot of literature linking them to stress and to trauma and so on. If they can understand when there's a flare-up, oh, let me look at my life. How was I stressing myself? How was I not setting my boundaries? How was I trying to please others? They can actually let the disease instruct them to be more authentic. And then they don't have to flare up so much.
So I'm sure you're familiar with Louise Hay, and she was kind of a pioneer in your illnesses being connected to an emotion. Yeah. And she even has a list of, different disorders, and then and she'll have like a positive mantra for you to say to kind of combat it. And do you have anything to say about that?
Well, look, she's one of the intuitives,
Yeah.
And I'm not. I'm more of a, I have some insights and intuitions, but I don't have kind of sense that she does. So I do agree that certain personality patterns, we've talked about some of them, do potentiate illness of all kinds, but I'm not able to make the kind of differentiation that she makes as to this particular emotion leads to that particular illness. I don't have that kind of insight, and nor do I have the scientific proof for it. Whereas what I do have scientific proof for is that if you separate yourself, if you disconnect, if you repress yourself, you're going to have major risk for all kinds of illnesses. So I can't be as specific as she is. And as far as mantras, there's different strokes for different folks, but I mean, for my particular stubborn brain, these positive affirmations never did very much. I mean, they're very good when I'm feeling good. When I'm feeling upset or bad, those mantras fly out of the window. I'm not even aware that they exist. So for me, that wouldn't work. But I know that she's very much respected by a lot of others, and that's all. That's all I can say about it.
Okay, so I mean, I've heard you say that loneliness, extreme loneliness, causes, and that's a big. That's like almost it's almost like an epidemic, right? People are suffering from loneliness all over the place. We're disconnected from each other and ourselves, even though people will go home and then will go on the internet as if that's real life, and they'll go to Facebook and they'll act like that's what's really like they're actually doing. They're not, right? Or not. And you say extreme loneliness can be as bad as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Now.
That's what the research shows, yeah.
And how did they come up with 15?
You know what? Maybe it's 14 and a half.
Okay.
I don't know. But here's the thing, though. It is an epidemic, so that, the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, wrote a book about loneliness. And in Britain, they had to appoint a minister for loneliness.
That's right.
What they don't talk about is that the loneliness epidemic has really burgeoned since the onset of neoliberalism under Thatcher and Reagan and their followers in all parties, whether it's Labour in the state in Britain or Democrats and under neoliberal regimes, loneliness rises in epidemic ways. So again, on loneliness, what we have to understand here is that loneliness is not, because we are biopsychosocial creatures, and because connections maintain the health of our immune system and our neurological system and so on, when we lose those connections, those systems suffer. Scientifically, that's just an obvious fact. What we don't talk about so much is that loneliness isn't an isolated individual issue. It's a social issue to do with the way this culture is going and the rising inequality and the stress on people, which are social phenomena. Political, economic phenomena, which then affect health.
I mean, you talk a lot in the book about how capitalism is crushing us emotionally, and how it sets up us to be inauthentic, to be disconnected from ourselves. And so, what should we do about capitalism? What is people? Because I guess it gets back to the title of the book, The Myth of Normal. Talk a little bit about that. What we consider normal is actually unhealthy.
Yeah. Well, in terms of capitalism, one friend of mine once said that every monopolization is rising. I mean, before we began the program, you talked about how there used to be 50 media organizations, now there are 6 major ones. Mm-hmm. So everything is getting monopolized. Fewer people are owning everything. So one friend of mine said, the way you deal with capitalism is you wait till one guy owns everything and then you shoot him, and then.
Well, I guess I wait till it's going to be Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos. Who's the lucky winner? We'll see.
Elon Musk, you never know. However, in my joviality, I forgot your question. What did you ask me?
So just how normal, just getting back to the title of the book, The Myth of Normal, what normal is and how it's actually unhealthy.
Right. So in medical terms, what is normal equates to what is healthy and natural. So within a certain range of temperatures, which is called a normal temperature, we're healthy. If it's too low, we die. If it's too high, we die. There's a certain range of blood pressure. We can thrive, but outside of it, we're sick or not even alive anymore. So normal equates to healthy and natural. And so what we used to is also healthy and natural. But then we transpose that to society in general. And we think that what we used to, the norm, is also healthy and natural. And what I'm saying is that in this culture, like we talked about the isolation, what is the general view of human nature in a capitalist culture? Is that humans are acquisitive, selfish, competitive, and grasping. Now, you believe that, you're going to be very lonely. or you're going to impose loneliness on a lot of people. And so in a society where those traits, and by the way, when somebody does something selfish or greedy, what do we say? We say, well, that's just human nature. But when somebody does something generous and kind and open-hearted, do we say, oh, that's just human nature? But actually, that's much closer to human nature, the way we evolved, than what we've got now. So in a society then, what we consider to be normal, what we're used to, is neither healthy or natural. And that's the largest meaning, or that's the overarching meaning of the myth of normal.
Yeah. So, it's normal for people to work 2 or 3 jobs in America right now. That's not healthy, but it's normal.
What? There's a story that we didn't include in the book. I wish we had, but we had to cut the book somewhere. But George Bush Jr. was at some kind of town hall meeting in Texas once.
We've showed this video on the show many times.
Where this woman is asking about old age pension, and a woman says, "I got 3 jobs," and Bush says, "See that? She's got 3 jobs. Only in America. Isn't this wonderful?"
He said, "Uniquely American."
Uniquely American, isn't it?
Yeah, that's how normal we think it is. Is it normal for somebody in their 60s to have to work at 2 or 3 jobs to cling to
Texas?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's considered normal. What's it? Not Lyft, but not Uber, but Lyft. We didn't include this in the book either. There was a woman who worked for Lyft, who was pregnant, and she was a driver for Lyft, and she goes into labor.
Oh.
And she still picks up a fare on her way to the hospital. And Lyft put this on their website as a wonderful example.
Of course they did. This is like White Lotus. You watch White Lotus? This is exactly, they probably heard that story.
Until there was an outrage and they had to take it off their website. But this is how normal it is, Like a pregnant woman or a woman in labor should be working, to make money and serve the company.
So we talk a lot about this. It's poverty porn. They like to say, "Hey, here's a guy who walks 12 miles a day to work," and then his coworkers got together and bought him a bike, and somehow that's supposed to be some feel-good story. Or they had another one where a kid got in a car accident, and he's a college student, and he still works full time. He had a car accident, and they showed him with the cast on, and he's still working at Taco Bell and I'm like, that's not. These aren't feel-good stories. These are depressing. Stories about the end of capitalism. So I wanted to talk, if you have time to talk about, you've done psychedelics and they've helped you. Can you talk a little bit about how it's helped you open up and get less dense?
Yeah, I'm still pretty dense actually, but just ask my wife. But or my children sometimes. It was about 13 years ago I published my most previous book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, a book on addiction, in which I argued what I argued earlier on your program, that in fact addiction is not a disease, inherited or otherwise, nor is it a bad choice. It's a response to trauma, the loss of some essential quality of ourselves. And around that time, people started asking me, I was on this book tour, and people would ask me, what do you know about ayahuasca, which is a Peruvian plant, a psychedelic plant, shamanic plant, and the healing of addiction? I say, I know nothing. And I go to the next venue, what do you know about, and I got sick of the question. I said, get the hell out of here already. I've just spent 3 years writing a book and you're asking me about the one thing I don't know anything about. But finally somebody said, you know what, you could try this in Vancouver, because there's a Peruvian shaman underground coming up to Vancouver where I live, and I did the ceremony with the plant, and within half an hour I had tears of love flowing down my face. Love such as I'd never experienced before. Love not for what particular thing or particular person, but just open-hearted love. And I realized 2 things. I realized how I closed my heart very early in life, because it was bruised so badly when I was an infant, that I closed it down to protect itself, to defend itself, and how good it feels to open it. And I thought, well, if psychedelics can do for me in one ceremony, what could they do for a lot of other conditions? And no, the truth was 2 things that have to be, just to be clear about. One, I thought I was now transformed. I'm going to be this wonderfully happy enlightened person. Nah, I wasn't, and as anybody could tell you. And the other thing is, at the next ceremony, I thought, well, if the first ceremony was full of light and joy and love like that, what will the next one be? It was misery, And so, but here's what I've learned. But I've worked with psychedelics for the last 13 years now. Mostly ayahuasca quite a bit. I've led retreats with it to help people heal from all kind of conditions, addictions, physical illness, mental health conditions. No panacea, by the way, but they can provide a lot of help that Western medicine can't even dream about providing, because the psychedelics open up the membrane between the conscious and the unconscious. And you mentioned earlier about so much of the stuff is carried in the unconscious, but the psychedelics, in a proper setting, in a safe setting, with expert guidance, where there's actually compassion and support for you, they can show you what you've been carrying in there, but you were afraid to look at all your life. But now you can look at it with the eyes of a mature adult. So you can learn so much about yourself. So I worked with ayahuasca, other plants, mushrooms, iboga from Africa, MDMA, occasionally some other substances. And the psychedelics, again, are no panacea. They're not going to save the world. They're not going to save health. They're not going to save the mental health system. But in the right context, a lot of research and a lot of experience has shown they can sure provide something that nothing in the Western armamentarium can possibly even approach in terms of insight and the potential for healing. So that's in a nutshell. I also know people who exploit psychedelics to sexually abuse others. I mean, like, everything's got its shadow side, as you know, having done some Jungian work. But the psychedelics do have a lot of promise, and it's absolutely, let me tell you about one particular psychedelic. There's a plant called iboga, which is from Africa, from Gabon, where the people there have been using it for hundreds of years for ceremonies. Now, iboga is amazing, not only because it allows you to put you in touch with the unconscious and work out your trauma. And there's some work now with U.S. veterans with PTSD. They're having amazing results. But if you're a heroin addict, an opiate addict, and you do this iboga treatment, again, only under the most safe circumstances, after 1 or 2 nights, you have no withdrawal from the opiates, even after 20 years of heroin use. I've seen this with my own eyes. Now,
I've heard about that before too.
Really?
Yeah. Well, there's nothing in Western medicine that even comes within 10 million miles of being able to do that. Now, why aren't we investigating it more? Why don't they make this a priority? When you have 100,000 overdoses in the States last year, why the heck don't they allow more work with it? You know where this work is done? It has to be done illegally in North America, or people have to go to Mexico or other countries to engage in it. It's insane. No, it's got its risks, but again, in the right hands, those risks can be largely mitigated, and the payoff is immense.
It's the ivermectin of the psychology world. So nobody wants to talk about it. It's illegal. So can you speak quick about what is your do you have spirituality? How would you call it that? Do you believe in a higher power? How do you think it all works?
Well, the older I get, the more I'm open that way. I grew up as quite a confirmed atheist for a very simple reason. In Eastern Europe, where I grew up under communism, there used to be a joke that you can be honest, intelligent, or a member of the Communist Party. In fact, you can be any two of those things, but not all three at the same time. Okay. You might say the same thing about a lot of the parties here in the West as well, by the way. But the God they gave me, as a kid, I could figure this out. God could be omniscient, all-knowing, all good, or all powerful, or two of those three things, but not three at the same time. If he was all good, then he couldn't know anything. Because how come Auschwitz happened? So I never believed in that God. And therefore, I really closed myself off to sort of religious perspectives. But over the years, exploring some aspect of Buddhism, reading deeply into Jesus, being acquainted with indigenous traditions, I'm more and more open to this. I know what you mean by a higher power. there's a part of ourselves that's within us, actually. It's not outside of us, that just wants to be open and at one and in unity with the universe, and to feel that unity, to experience it, and get beyond the limitations of the egoic mind. And yeah, that's in all of us. And now, am I very disciplined? No. I mean, in one of my books, I say that I have a profound relationship with meditation. I think about it every day, you know. With my ADD brain, I just, you know, I just don't have that kind of discipline. But you know what? 10 days ago, I started doing my yoga again, and it feels a lot better, you know. So, and you know, and spirituality, of course, doesn't necessarily mean anything, because it could be religious, but it could also be nature and meditation and yoga and all kinds of other activities. So,
well,
yeah, the more open I am to it, the more I see the reality of it. Yeah.
Do you believe we share a collective unconscious, as Campbell and Jung have said?
You know what? I never could know quite what that means. What I do believe is that our unconscious. Well, you know what? Of course I do. When I think about it, because our brains are so connected. I mean, our brains are, not as I point out, but as great scientists point out, are interactive, dynamic organs that are affected by and share the energies and tones of other brains. So of course we share an unconscious. And my unconscious, if I'm in a relationship with you particularly, my unconscious is going to affect yours, and vice versa.
100%. So I think that the unconscious is our conduit to God, right? And there's only one consciousness, right, that we all share, and that this is my theory anyway, and that through, if you go inward, as Jung says, he who goes inward awakens, he who looks outward dreams. And so all the answers are inward. I've had many profound experiences where my dreams have presented wisdom to me that I didn't have access to in my conscious ego mind. And so now I totally through experience, believe in this higher power consciousness that we're all connected to. And, you know, you talk about when you live with someone, you're going to share so I had this very spiritual dream. It involved a green car. I won't go into it. It's very long. But there was this green car, and I was coveting it. I'm like, God, it's the most beautiful green car I've ever seen in my life. And then I realized I was in the exact same green car, right? Which is a very powerful spiritual thing. And I wake up, and the first thing my wife says is, hey, I had a dream about a green car last night, and I almost fell down. And I was like, God, get the F out of here. And go ahead.
My wife has said, I've not had these direct experiences of unity personally. You know, the closest I've come to it has been with some psychedelics sometimes, which I talk about in the book. But my wife once had the experience at a time when we had a very difficult crossroads at our marriage, and she was really suffering. And thanks to Moa. And she surrendered to it. She said, I can't fight this. And everything became one, and everything just became pure energy. And she realized there was no birth, there was no death, there's just energy. And she fully felt it and realized it. And she was conscious that she was conscious of it, you know? So maybe that relates to some of the experience that you've had. She had that experience. I haven't. But if she's had it, and if you've had it, and so many other people have had it, it means it's available to us all on some level.
Well, what I've experienced is that I used to think that I was making the decisions, that I control my ego consciousness, the consciousness that I'm aware of. I have to take in all kinds of information, and then I make the decisions. And so I've had several things happen with me when I realized I am not in control, and that there is a greater consciousness that is in control, and that it's my goal to get in touch with that. And that is, and the way to do that is to go inward, not outward.
Exactly. Well, you know, when you go with the 10 Commandments, you know, they can be seen as sort of pretty harsh laws, but they can also be interpreted exactly the way you just said it. Because when God says, I'm the God and I'll have no other gods before me, you know, what they're saying is there's this unitary consciousness, and anything smaller that you try to replace it with, you're going to create suffering for other people, you know. So that unitary consciousness is present in all spiritual traditions, whether it's Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, or indigenous, you know. And you'd have to think, if that's the case, there's some universal reality here that people are tapping into, you know. And I think that's what you're describing.
Yes. So what of so I don't know how much time you have, but I went through Russiagate, and I saw you did an episode with Aaron, your son, about the psychology of Russiagate and how people had responded to that through their own trauma. And so now we just went through COVID, and we're at the end of it now, or the emergency part. And I took a lot of grief because I questioned the narrative, because I got vaccine injured. And as soon as I looked into it, Gabor, I realized that they were lying about everything. They lied about masks. They lied about herd immunity, natural immunity. They lied about early treatments. They lied about ivermectin. They lied about transmission. They lied about contraction. There wasn't a thing I looked into that they weren't lying about. And they're still doing it. And so I pushed back, and now really tumultuous in my life, like very close. I mean, just splits up. I've lost lots of very close friends over it, and people now project the worst things in the world on me. Like, and so what was that? Why? So I feel like I was just consistent to my lefty question authority beliefs and values, and everybody else dropped it. Now everybody else, we all know Big Pharma is the most evil people in the world, and so is government. They're owned by them, but somehow when they come together, they make beautiful babies. And so I don't understand why. Not only did those people who I think are the biggest cynics, which are comedians, and that's why I love them, but they had no cynicism around this, and they just repeated Big Pharma propaganda without any skeptic. I don't care if you agree with what Big Pharma is saying, but shouldn't you first be skeptical of it? And so how did that all happen?
They were mad that you even were looking at it at all.
They were mad that I was even looking at it. Yeah. Like, so I got vaccine injured, and then I talked about it, and people got angry at me for telling my truth because they said it would make other people vaccine hesitant. So go ahead. I'll stop. That's a long question. So you take whatever you want.
Sure. So I saw your segment about Tim Robbins the other day.
Oh, I love that guy.
Who at some point was very critical and even disdainful of people who didn't go for vaccines, and then apologized. That's why I understood it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So look, I'm a medical doctor, and so I'm also a skeptical person, and then this whole book is my whole critique of the Western medical system and the pharmaceutical industry. And I mean, that's a big, that's not all the book is about, but it's certainly in there. So I'm not an automatic believer either. But in the beginning, and I think you said this yesterday, either you said it or Tim Robbins said it, that in the beginning, when we didn't know yet how to deal with this overwhelming threat that ended up killing 1 million Americans, which is a whole other story about why one of the major risk factors for dying of COVID was being an American, you know. People who actually, I'm no longer active as a physician, but people that I know, really conscientious, scientific minded, very earnest people, you know, they were really trying to do their best to control this pandemic, and masks arguably did diminish the risk of transmission. And when the vaccines came around, they certainly diminished the risk of significant illness. It was also thought in the beginning that they would also diminish the risk of transmission, which turned out not to be the case, as you pointed out in your segment with about Tim Robbins. These colleagues of mine, though, however, what I never doubted is what they were telling me, is that these people that I know that work in intensive care units, the vast majority of people they saw there were people that were unvaccinated, you know? So in the beginning, there was certainly a rationale for trying to impose certain standards. Now, what I did say right from the beginning, and by the way, stay even now, it's going to take us some distance from this to actually look back and to figure out what was right and what was wrong, and what should have happened and what shouldn't have happened. What is certainly true is that you had a society in panic response. And when people are in panic and in fear, they're going to do all kinds of things that may be harsh. Now, as to the rest, I haven't followed the scandals around Fauci and so on, and at some point I will look into it. Frankly, I've been too busy writing this book. And now, as to your vaccine injury, yes, of course, vaccines, any medical procedure, whether it's taking an aspirin or a bit of surgery or a vaccine, anytime you interfere with the human body, there's the risk of causing damage. And the big question for the people, my physician colleagues, was, which is the greater risk? The statistically relatively small risk, as they understood it, of vaccine injury, or the risk of a lot of people dying of COVID. And they said the smaller risk is worth taking in order to mitigate the larger risk. As to pharmaceutical companies, and I mean, there's so many scandals around this. One of the scandals is the vaccines were delivered. Whatever you think of the vaccines, and some people are absolutely against them, but whatever you think of them, they were developed with public money. And who gets to make the profit? Private corporations. Why? Because the system is designed to serve their interests. So naturally, people are skeptical and skeptical or highly doubtful and even resistant. So I know I'm not actually addressing the issue that you raised totally directly. I'm just giving you my overall perspective on it. I totally get where you're coming from. I think it's a debate that's going to go on for a long time, and I think it needs to. Let me just say that.
Go ahead.
The really lamentable thing about it is the venom, the rancor on both sides. You know, the like Tim Robbins, you know, as he acknowledged about himself, and you know, I have to say I probably shared in it to some degree. I no longer do, of the disdain for people who are so-called refusers. You know, there's so many people, so many reasons why people might resist the vaccine. You know, and we don't know what's in their minds. We don't know what's in their histories. We need to be much more gentle and appreciative of differences. And one of the things that has really gone out the window is civility and discourse.
So I was on both sides. I was both things. So I was Tim Robbins. I was great. I was so afraid of the virus. I was convinced if I got it was going to kill me. I was convinced. And I remember I went to my brother's house, and I've told this story in my special. So my brother lives in Indiana on a lake, and he has a boat. And so he has a liver condition, and so I have a bone condition, and we were both convinced if we got COVID, we would die. And so he said, well, if you're quarantining, we can trust each other. Why don't you come spend some time on our lake house? And I was like, that's a great idea. So I rented a van. I drove to Indiana. And when I got there, it turns out that to my standards, they weren't quarantining as how I was mental over the quarantining way more than they were. And then I flipped out, you know, and I just flipped out like the biggest asshole in the world. I was, you know, and I was just swearing at them and calling them, you know, I called them everything. And then because I knew as soon as I was done yelling, I had to get in my van and drive all the way back to California because there was nowhere to go. It was COVID. So I was the worst offender of the then I got vaccine injured, and then I woke up, right? And then I'm like, oh, wait a minute. And so that's why I have open arms for those people, right? But first they have to say they're sorry.
What's the thing where you're like, I'm never going to find out about it, and it becomes like, you know, you're Dottie Sandusky from being the adult child of an alcoholic, where you're like, well, actively, I don't go in the basement and see what's going on down there. That's the thing I find. Yeah,
like the people.
Angry.
So what you're saying is their ignorance on purpose. They didn't want to get informed about it, even after the
I'm ignorant
evidence.
All the time. I wouldn't hold that against anybody. But
right.
The thing where you go, it reminds me of being when I was a Jehovah's Witness, dude.
It's like you're going to be adamant about something without the information on purpose.
Because now it's stumbling your faith and the faith of your brother from.
Right.
They used to tell me that Jehovah's Witnesses. Don't read that book about how Jehovah's Witnesses works. It could stumble you.
It can stumble
from
you
the truth.
And then if you stumble onto a truth, then you say it, it'll make someone else stumble. And that's what they were. That's Kurt. That's such a good observation that with your Jehovah's Witnesses, that's exactly what it was like around COVID.
But with
you weren't
medicine,
allowed. With medicine, you weren't allowed to question it because it might make someone else stumble or become vaccine
this theoretical,
hesitant.
Stupid person who doesn't know how to read and shouldn't read and shouldn't look up anything.
So I can ask it this way. So. What became commonplace during COVID was to shame people for being interested or intellectually curious about this medical treatment or anything. And people would say, don't do your own research. Like, that's a mantra. That became a cliche. Oh, please tell me you're not doing your own research. And I have to explain to people, before COVID, doing your own research was just called reading. And so how do we get to the point where people who used to be cynics are shaming people for reading while telling them they're dumb?
Well, you know what it reminds me of? I have to say this conversation with the two of you just now. It reminds me of Russiagate, because my son Aaron, and yourself as well, who were skeptical right from the beginning about this, for damn good reason, and because there was just zero evidence for Russiagate and all kinds of evidence to the contrary. But he's lost a lot of friends who, on the left, who are otherwise really good-hearted people, progressive and so on, but that on that issue, they just refuse to do their own research. So there's this powerful dynamic to belong to the crowd, and then not to be on the outside of it. And that goes back to this question of, do we want authenticity or do we want connection? And a lot of people unconsciously, I'm not going to belong to the crowd, which means I'm not going to do my own research. I'm going to go along with what the crowd believes. And I'll be hostile to somebody who believes otherwise. That's a powerful dynamic, I think, on all sides in this particular society.
You talk a lot about politics in your book, and this will be my last question. I appreciate you making all this time for us. But the message of this show is that the establishment is successfully distracting us and dividing us artificially, and that we have more things in common with my neighbor, which would be considered a Trumper or a right-winger, that I have more in common with them than I certainly have with Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and Jeff Bezos, and that we actually have a common enemy, and that they're playing up the things that separate us instead of playing up the things that connect us, and that we actually and that's what the establishment's really afraid of, is when the people on the left and the right come together for a common purpose against a common enemy, which is them, the establishment, the 1%. That's the thing that scares them the most. And so when I did that, when I started reaching out and trying, because I was always, the society tells you half the country's your enemy. And could you just talk about the psychology of that and the pushback I get from when I try to reach out to because I'm not going to blame an American, my neighbor, they did a controlled demolition of our economy during COVID, and people experienced a lot of pain, and then they wanted you to get angry at your neighbor for not taking a vaccine instead of being angry at the oligarchs who are imposing this on you. So go ahead, take it whatever you want.
Well, this goes back to Hillary Clinton's famous and fatal faux pas in the 2016 election, when he called almost half the people a basket of deplorables, and I was talking to Noam Chomsky once, and I grew up in communist Hungary, where the propaganda system was crude, it was controlled, it was really vicious, but almost everybody could see through it. And here, the propaganda system is so much more sophisticated, so much more clever. People have the illusion of freedom when actually they're stumbling on in the dark with lack of information. Other people are pulling the strings. Their own unconscious, as we said earlier, is pulling the strings. And so that it's easy to divide people. And I think that's a very important dynamic in this culture. And it's certainly one of the ways that the system maintains itself. And it's so easy for somebody of a different class to have disdain for somebody in a different economic circumstance. They hollowed out the American industrial heartland well before COVID, and now you have these deaths of despair, over 100,000 overdoses. almost as many people died, almost twice as many people died, or close to it, in 1 year of overdoses than Americans died in the Vietnam, Afghan, and Iraq was put together. And let alone, I'm not even talking about the 3 million Vietnamese and 500,000 Iraqis and so on, but I'm just talking about, yet, nobody's talking about the real social conditions that drive those deaths of despair. And so there's a good reason why we don't talk about it, because to talk about it would be to bring people together, recognizing that the system is actually, whether they know it or not, whether they're able to recognize it or not, is manipulating them. And that manipulation doesn't happen in a vacuum. It benefits a certain strata.
It definitely. So, when I say that there's a class war and these people are conspiring together, they go, "Oh, really, Jimmy? When do they have these meetings? Where do the rich people?" I go, "Well, first of all, the meeting is every time they have a session of Congress." Who do you think, whose interest do you think those people are representing? Mine? No, they're representing the 1% of the 1% of the powerful people who actually make the decisions and run things. And as Aaron, your son, pointed out, that was the real problem with Trump, was that not that he did anything different. He's another billionaire just like them, but he put a bad face on the the establishment and our imperialism and our empire. And that's exactly what it was. They couldn't do 2 nuclear wars, what they're trying to do right now. With Trump, people would be running around with their hair on fire, but you got Demented Joe, so everybody's okay with it. But anyway, go ahead.
I'm not sure about. Like, there are plenty of conspiracies. Like, you can actually show that the drug companies conspire, or the tobacco companies conspire, or the right-wing military cabal conspires. There's plenty of evidence for that. But overall, the system is more elegant than that. It kind of creates its own ideology, and people buy into it, and they perpetuate it. Even with that, now the conspiracies are there, but overall the system is not a conspiracy. The system is a system that sustains itself by the dynamics and the divisions and the beliefs that it inculcates in people. So that, yes, there are some conspiracies, and it was, I forget who, the man who wrote, I was a hitman for this year.
Economic Hitman?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what was that? Remember the name of the author?
I don't remember, but it's Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Mm-hmm.
Exactly, yeah. So he said, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, I'm a conspiracy realist, he said.
Yeah.
But in addition to the conspiracies, there's a kind of self-perpetuating elegance to the system.
Well, because you don't have to make it secret. You could do it in the open. It's not even a conspiracy.
Yeah, they do it right out in the open.
Exactly.
Is there a question you wish I would have asked you? I didn't?
Well, it's been a very wide-ranging and, for me, very rich conversation. Maybe I'll just say that the overall intention of this book, which, by the way, I'm happy to say next week will be celebrated its 8th week on the New York Times bestsellers list. And it's been a number 1 book in Canada as well. But my intention wasn't just to show people the problem with this culture, but also to illustrate that we can actually become authentic. And even in this culture, we don't have to buy into its values, and we don't have to buy into what it made us believe about ourselves, that healing is actually possible. And so the overall message I want to leave people with is actually a positive one. And the long section of the book is actually the healing section. So we make a very strong critique, I think, here of Western culture and the medical system and so on. But overall, I do believe in human beings and their capacity for collaboration and goodness and connection and what you call the higher power.
John Perkins was the author of the Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Gabor Mate, the author of The Myth of Normal. Also, by the way, your son helped co-author the book. Daniel Mate, who's a friend of mine, I've had the pleasure of meeting. So congratulations on that. And, when I worked with my father doing brickwork and masonry, it was the worst thing in the world for our relationship. So I bet you guys had a better time than we did. But thank you.
He reads it on Audible.
We had our moments, believe me. But anyway.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Daniel reads it on Audible, and it sounds fantastic. Gabor Mate, thank you so much for making time, and good luck. Hope we can meet sometime in person.
Likewise, and thanks so much for having me.
We'll see you November 19th and 20th in Austin, Texas. November 26th, that's the Saturday after Thanksgiving in Burbank. And then all December, we're going to be in Los Angeles doing Friday night shows. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for all the tickets and become a premium member. While you're there, you get all of our videos unedited. jimmydore.com, not Jimmy Dore Comedy.